We're going to be looking in this series of videos at the question of Jesus' resurrection, one of the great questions of all history. But in order to get a handle on that question, we need to ask first, who was Jesus? And what do we know about him? What was his life all about? Why did he die? And all those questions that cluster around that. So in this first video, we're going to be looking at that whole issue of Jesus himself. And that is, of course, something that's been enormously controversial, actually, particularly in North America recently. I've noticed coming over from the UK that to raise the question of who was Jesus is at once to send a signal that all sorts of other questions are on the table as well. It acts as a kind of a lightning rod for that, for many other issues in the North American culture, and I think in Western culture more widely. So it's perhaps not surprising that over the last century, really, but then particularly just the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a great deal of discussion and speculation and historical argument. Was Jesus just a great moral teacher? Was he a great hero of faith, a great leader? Was he a doom and gloom apocalyptic prophet saying the world was going to end in the next day or hour or week? Or was he simply at a more cooler level a teacher of spirituality, or somebody who was offering a new way of going to heaven or something like that? All those have been tried, and people have written great books about them, and more recently, in the last 10 or a dozen years, we've seen, particularly in North America, several different writers and movements who have tried to argue that Jesus had nothing whatever to do with apocalyptic and all that end of the world stuff, or conversely, that that's precisely what he was about. And there's been a lot of debate and discussion about all of that, and I have had fun taking part in that debate myself. Now, as a historian, I think what I want to say about Jesus runs something like this. We can be most secure in talking about Jesus when we begin by saying that he was a first century Jewish prophet announcing the kingdom of God. And each little bit of that is kind of important. Of course, I want to go on to say that Jesus was much more than that, but that he wasn't any less. He was a prophetic figure and was perceived as that, and was happy when people talked of him as a prophet. As a prophet, he was starting or leading some kind of a movement, and lots of other people did that. You know, you don't have to say, does this mean he was founding a church with buildings and processions and robes and so on? You know, people did lead movements in the first century and start saying things that were slightly different, and that's what we know about Jesus. But then this kingdom of God business, people get so bothered about that. What is the kingdom of God? In Jesus' day, it was a revolutionary slogan. It meant that God was going to be king in a way which meant that Caesar and Herod pretty certainly weren't anymore. It was a way of saying we want God alone to be our master, our king, our ruler. And that's fine. People sometimes say, well, wasn't God always king? Wasn't God always the ruler of the world? And well, the answer to a Jew is, well, he was and he wasn't, you know. There's a sense in which, of course, God is ruling, but if God is ruling, why are all these bad things happening to us, to Israel, to the world, etc.? And so Jesus, in coming in saying, now is the time, is offering not just good advice about how to live your life or about how to go to heaven when you die or whatever, but good news. That's the big distinction, I think, in contemporary scholarship about Jesus, that a lot of people are basically turning Jesus into somebody who's offering good advice. And as I see it, Jesus is saying, no, something is happening. It's news, and you've got to get on board with the thing that's happening. And Jesus' kingdom announcement was then made through all these parables, which are not just, you know, neat, timeless teaching turned into prepackaged stories for kids who can't understand the abstract theory. It's not like that. He's telling a story about something that's happening. Only the trouble is, it's not quite what his hearers had expected. So he's constantly saying, yeah, the thing that you were wanting to happen is happening, but it doesn't look quite like you thought it would. And so there's a clash always between Jesus and some of the expectations of the people around him, and some of the symbols which they expect to accompany the kingdom the way they see it. For instance, the Sabbath and the food laws, they expect that when the kingdom comes, it will reaffirm the sort of Judaism they know. And Jesus is saying, no, it's bigger than that, it's different, it's more explosive than that, it's going out beyond. And all of that reaches a climax when Jesus, towards the end of his public career, which is very short, arrives in Jerusalem for the last time and does this dramatic thing in the temple, which seems to say, here is a claim being staked. And when we look in the historical context and say, what sort of person comes to Jerusalem and does something dramatic like this in the temple, it's a royal thing, it's a king sort of thing, it's a Messiah sort of thing. And yet Jesus isn't quite the sort of Messiah that some might have been expecting. So there's again an odd edge to this. Is he the Messiah or isn't he? And then as we look at what Jesus is doing in the temple and in Jerusalem, it appears that in going up to Jerusalem, he has a different agenda again. He's not going up in order to sit on a throne and be king in the way that his followers seem to have expected. You know, they want him to be number one, and they're going to get the top jobs around him in this coming regime. Rather, Jesus really seems to believe, I think, and I've argued this in detail in some of my work, that it is his vocation to be a different sort of Messiah, a sort of Messiah which will end with his own death. And he seems to be plugging into many of those Jewish traditions about martyrdom and about redemptive suffering, which go back through some of the martyrs of the previous generations in his world, through to the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. And so Jesus, I believe, knew that it was his vocation to come and be that sort of a Messiah and to claim his sort of kingdom through his own suffering and death. Now, that's all very well. Clearly, his followers were not on board with this. This was not their agenda at all. And so the question that then is posed for us and for any historian of the first century, and it's the question we're going to be looking at throughout the series of videos, is why then did Christianity begin? Because after all, there were lots of other messianic or prophetic movements within a century or so either side of Jesus that ended with the violent death of the founder. And nobody the next day said, oh, he really was the Messiah and we must go on following him in some sense. So that'll be the question that will launch us into the other videos in this series. But for this first one, we just need to take some time then and reflect on what was this kingdom of God? Does it make sense? So how does this all strike you? What questions do you have arising out of all of this?
As a parish pastor, that phrase, kingdom of God, is always curious, trying to make that relevant for today, since we don't live with kings and queens or kingdom, and trying to understand for folks to say, when Jesus was talking about the kingdom of God, what does that mean? Because there's political elements when Jesus spoke that, but some of the words that we use now don't fit politically.
Yes, and actually when people say this to me as a Brit, you know, we do have a queen,
Right,
we've had
exactly.
kings, we make another king.
Yeah.
Actually, that makes it harder, not easier, because the sort of monarchy that we have is a modern constitutional monarchy and is totally unlike Caesar or Herod in the first century, so that we all have to make that leap back. There aren't too many regimes which are exactly like those. There are one or two in some parts of the world, but yeah, quite, thank goodness there aren't. But this is part of the point. Jesus seems actually to be sailing close to the wind in some ways, in that by saying kingdom of God, he knows that this is a phrase with huge political resonances, and yet he's going with that. And I think that what we have done in the late Western world is often to downgrade that and to say it was a quote-unquote purely spiritual thing. I think that's very damaging as well. So yes, but Jesus is saying it's a political thing, but it's an upside-down political thing. It's the reversal of all the power games that the world is playing, and yet it is the most powerful thing of all. And that you can see going on through Paul into the early church. And God chose what was weak to shame the strong, and that's very much a political statement. And I think we wrestle with this in our churches, that it is, of course, about God and a different sort of kingdom, but that different sort doesn't mean, therefore, it's a purely spiritual thing with no implications for this world. It means, therefore, the implications for this world are that we're not just joining in the ordinary power games, we're doing it differently.
And so much more subtle today, living with a sympathetic, democratic political scene in which we try to say, now, are we, is that struggle that Jesus had
Yes,
against
yes,
those
yes.
oppressive powers of Herod
Yes,
or
yes.
Caesar at a distance, what was palatable.
And
How do
yet,
we-
and yet, you see, we think of our democracy as a much more user-friendly thing, and so in many ways it is. And yet, it horrifies me on both sides of the Atlantic to see, for instance, that in order to run for office, you have to be well endowed
Indeed,
financially.
indeed.
You have to be
That's
this,
right.
that, and the other.
That's right.
And there are things in our system which I think are more insidious because we don't notice them. And I sometimes wonder what Jesus would say about them.
So that revolutionary idea isn't completely out of date. Sometimes I think we've spiritualized the kingdom because it does seem more user-friendly, and instead of being a small minority looking up and wishing that there was another reign in which we could participate, we are the majority, at least in this country still, perhaps barely, but still. And it makes a difference in how you evaluate a revolutionary.
It certainly does. And of course, your country began with a revolution against my country,
Quite
and often using very deeply biblical language to sustain
Indeed.
that. And very ambiguous a lot of that stuff was on both sides of the Atlantic. So, I mean, I think we've established, really, we cannot simply spiritualize this.
Indeed.
Where do we go from
Tom, could you touch upon the temple, how significant that Jesus ended up there in Jerusalem
Right.
at the temple, and,
Right.
and why not at the palace or the praetorium or some other
Right.
place?
Yeah, I think this is enormously important. We easily slip into thinking in the Western world that the temple was just like, a great cathedral, which would just be on a street corner somewhere, and it'd be a nice building and a religious center, but not much more. But for a first century Jew, the temple quite literally was the center of the cosmos. Old medieval maps would have the world with Jerusalem in the middle, and that represents actually something very profound of Jewish consciousness, that the Jerusalem and the temple were at the middle of not just the globe, but of the cosmos, and the temple was the place where God had chosen to live. And so to come there was to come to the living, beating heart of everything that mattered. And then to do something like claiming authority over that is about as huge a claim as it was possible to make in that culture.
Do you think that as Jesus went about being prophetic, that he had a vision for including non-Jews in this kingdom of God in a way that was shocking to?
Yeah, I think he did, but I think there's two things to say about that. I think the most important thing to recognize is that in some of the Jewish prophetic writings, including some of the ones that Jesus plugged into, like Isaiah. For instance, or as you say, Isaiah,
Right. Yeah.
there is this theme that when God does for Israel what God is going to do for Israel, then the rest of the world is going to get in on the act somehow as well. And that's part of what it means to be a Jewish-style monotheist, to believe that God has chosen Israel for the sake of the world. Now, of course, when Israel was being battered and beleaguered by the pagan nations, then it was easy for Jews in Jesus' day to say, well, when God does for Israel what he's going to do for Israel, then the world will get judged and smashed to smithereens and condemned and all the rest of it. And Jesus is saying, God is now doing for Israel what he wanted to do for Israel. So, of course, pretty soon now, the nations are going to come in. Many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I think that makes a lot of sense that Jesus would have said that. However, it's interesting that since the early church, from very early on, went rapidly out with Paul and so on to the Gentile world, there are not many sayings like that in the gospel traditions, which look to me as though the early church has not actually put those back on the lips of Jesus. These are hints and signs. But of course, in Paul himself, we find a clear recognition that Jesus confined his ministry, his own personal ministry, to the Jewish people, and that he left the wider implications to be pursued by his followers.
And how complex that must have been, because there was
Yep.
no one normative Judaism, as we know.
Of course.
And so the audience not only reaching out to the Gentiles, but even what segment of the Judaisms of his day.
Yes, that's right. And we have, of course, the high-profile clashes with the Pharisees, which are very controversial in scholarship. But it seems to me when we realize the Pharisees' political agenda, we realize as well that whatever Jesus was saying, that was slicing clean across their political. It's not just that they had some funny disagreements about abstract theology. This stuff meant something at street level, but we have no record of Jesus addressing, say, the Essenes. He may well have known some Essenes. His cousin John the Baptist may have had some direct contact with the Essenes, but we have no record of that. So yes, we are piecing together this stuff. But I think in my reading of the early Jewish writers like Josephus, the great historian, for instance, it seems quite clear that an awful lot of his contemporaries, whatever their particular nuances, were very, very keen on getting rid of the Romans, becoming free at last, on some kind of a new exodus, the waiting for God to do again what God had done, bringing Israel out of Egypt and so on. So there was this air of expectation, and whenever anyone raised a flag of revolution, there were plenty of people who'd say, yep, let's do it.
Did all those people seem to buy into smashing the Gentiles? I mean, that's pretty strong language. And
It's difficult to say. My reading of it as best I can is that already in Jesus' day there was a kind of a hard line and a softer line, and to take the two schools of the Pharisees insofar as we know about them, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, who are teachers of the generation immediately before Jesus, it looks as though Hillel had been saying more, no, if you're a Jew, you study Torah, you live your life of prayer and obedience to God, etc. But we'll let the rest of the world do its own thing, and we'll even say some prayers for them and so on. Whereas the school of Shammai would say, no, that's not good enough. We've got to be hard line about this. We've got to be tough-minded. And as I read the evidence, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it was the school of Shammai that was in the ascendancy through the period of Jesus and Paul, and it was only after the destruction of the temple in 70, and then after the failure of the Great Revolt in the 130s, a century after Jesus, that then the Hillelites really came into their own. So my guess is that the majority of people who are following the teaching at the time of Jesus were the more hardliners.
Or at least those around him in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think so. And many in Galilee. Galilee was a hotbed of revolution, not perhaps as much as people have sometimes thought, but there was certainly a lot of revolutionary tendency there.
It is interesting to think how the message of Jesus, and we'll leave the resurrection piece for a minute, did spread into Jewish communities that received it happily outside of Jerusalem.
Oh yes, that's certainly true, and indeed one recent writer has argued very strongly that Jews for some centuries later went on being the people who are most likely to convert to Christianity, and that's not the way we've always read it, but I think there is a good argument to make for that. And the book of Acts implies very strong, states very strongly that there were thousands of Jews who said, wow, this is it. And as you say, obviously the resurrection had a lot to do with that, but the resurrection by itself in a vacuum couldn't have done that. It has to be grounded in who Jesus was and what he was doing.
Exactly, exactly.
Tom, could you fill in somewhat of the context in this opening conversation about Jesus as he was wandering the hills of Galilee? Was he a sentinel figure with his 12 disciples and a few others, or was that something that was normal? As we look back in the Bible and trying to understand who Jesus was, as he
was
moved
normal to have somebody wandering around with, well, we do know that there were other prophetic figures, other messianic figures, other leader figures who were emerging and had done in the generation immediately before Jesus and would go on doing through the 40s and 50s of the first century up to the cataclysmic war in the 60s against Rome. So I think, yes, it's quite reasonable to suppose that there were other figures. And those hills in Galilee, you know, we have that lovely hymn, O Sabbath rest by Galilee, O calm of hills above. But actually the hills were full of bandits, you know. They weren't calm at all. And the Sabbath rest by Galilee was a political point that we got to keep the Sabbath to keep those pagans at bay, you know. And we need to think back into that. So I think, yes, Jesus would have been, in a sense, a recognizable figure. Now, the choice of the 12, though, we don't have evidence, I think, that other leaders chose 12 followers. That's a very interesting one, because notice Jesus chose 12, not 11. He wasn't number one of the 12 new tribes, as it were. He was the one who called this 12 into existence. Very interesting symbolically.
Indeed it is. And that leads back to the question I was just thinking about. I mean, we've talked a little about kingdom of God, but what constituted the kingdom of God that Jesus was interested in? Political, not just spiritual, but different, not exactly the same, still in line with prophecy, but slightly an edge push that the Pharisees would not. What would you like to say about that?
Well, yes, it's very tricky, but it seems to me, looking at the evidence, that one of the things we have to say is the only way Jesus seemed to be able to describe it is, on the one hand, to tell stories, and on the other hand, to act symbolically. Now, both of those are counterintuitive for us in the Western world. We want fixed answers which we can put in a test tube and sift out. These stories and symbols, that's where it's at. But what we can see in those stories and symbols, I think, goes back into the prophetic scriptures, particularly I find the book of Isaiah again, and a passage which gradually as I was studying this became more and more important for me was Isaiah 52, where you get the herald on the mountains saying, "Your God reigns," which is kingdom of God. And there are three things going on in that passage. One is that evil is going to be defeated at last, whether the evil empire of Babylon or whatever. Another is obviously the vindication of Israel in terms of this great new exodus or the great final return from exile, or however you like to put it. And then the third thing, which I think we've often missed out, is that Israel's God himself, who they called at that time Yahweh, though by Jesus' day they didn't say that name, that Yahweh is going to return personally to Zion. And so you've got a sense of evil being defeated, you've got a sense of Israel being vindicated, and you've got the strong sense that God is coming back at last to reign as king. And how you put all that together, again, it takes stories and symbols to do it. And I think that Jesus was deliberately and dramatically telling those stories in new ways, always with himself in the middle of it. If I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, the kingdom of God has come upon you. You know, the call of the 12 is the renewal of Israel. And then I have argued elsewhere that his last great journey to Jerusalem was a deliberate acted symbol of God returning to Zion, that Jesus was, as it were, embodying that promise. And of course the Latin word for embodying is incarnating. And that's how I put the package together anyway.
Do you think that Jesus came seeking death? As you spoke earlier, I found myself wondering if he thought that it would require his death, or if he was willing to follow that kingdom path, even though it would lead to death.
I think it's a bit of both. I'm aware, very much aware, that if you sort of talk about Jesus seeking death, it sounds as though he's some kind of a kamikaze pilot, you know. But I mean, Socrates is an interesting model, and people have often paralleled Jesus and Socrates. Socrates did not want to die, but he remained true to the philosophical vision which he had had. And when they said, just step slightly this way and then we'll let you off, he said, I can't possibly do that. There's a question of integrity here. And I think that is all there in Jesus, and more so. However, I think what you find in Jesus is that he is constantly, by these stories and symbols, evoking those Jewish traditions which, as I said, go back through the martyrs of 200 years before his day, the Maccabees. Who did all that. And the Maccabees themselves were plugged into the book of Daniel, or the traditions around that, which were about redemptive suffering in a sense, or suffering and vindication. And the book of Daniel itself seems to be one of the earliest interpretations of the servant passages in Isaiah, which speak of suffering not merely as something which you may have to go through, but strangely something as a result of which God will redeem Israel and the world. And so I believe Jesus evoked those traditions. It wasn't that there was this sort of servant figure which he had on a peg and he pulled down and said, right, I'm the servant, that's it. It's more that there is a matrix of traditions, and he discovers his own. I mean, how do any of us know our vocation? That's a very interesting question. I think Jesus was aware of a vocation to go to the place where Israel and the world were in pain, to take that on himself, believing that somehow, if he did that, this would be the means of the kingdom coming, of evil being defeated, and indeed of Yahweh returning to Zion. And I think in Jesus' own self-understanding, the return of Yahweh to Zion climaxes on the cross. And that, I think, generates this explosion that we call New Testament theology. But I think it was there in a nutshell in the mind of Jesus.
So there was no sense in Jesus, you think, that as he was on the cross, Yahweh's return to Zion had been forestalled yet again? It's interesting to look back to Isaiah and Daniel and the Maccabees. In each case, the kingdom did not come.
It's very important to say, along with what I've just said, that Jesus did not go to the cross saying to himself, oh, well, that's okay, because in a couple of days I'm going to raise from the dead. That we find no trace of that in the Gospels at all. Indeed, Jesus in Gethsemane and then on the cross itself, and I do not think the early church could have made this up. It's so against what you might expect. Jesus seems to have had a sense of darkness and abandonment and failure. After all, it was failed messiahs who end up on crosses, not successful messiahs. And Jesus must have known that this was the biggest gamble out. This, Einstein's question as to whether God plays dice is right on the table here. This is a gamble. This is Jesus risking all, risking everything on the belief that maybe this was in fact the way to go, and knowing that if he wasn't right, he was the craziest blasphemer of his generation. And I really think that's where Jesus was as he went to the cross.
And death would be the appropriate end.
Well,
How
exactly.
could you go back from that realization?
Exactly.
Yeah, and still is for us today. He's either the crazy man or
Exactly,
right.
I think that's right, that people still face that, and this is the critical thing to realize, that Jesus, whatever you say about him, he can't just be a nice, cozy fellow to have on the side somewhere, to call on for some neat moral teaching or to look at as a great example. Jesus cannot be that. He is either a dangerous blasphemer or he really is who the New Testament says he is. And I say it like that because the Church has not always got the New Testament right on this. Indeed, one of the things I would say in drawing this first session to a close is that as we look at Jesus, I find continually that this is a great challenge to me as a pastor and priest and teacher. It's very difficult often to put the package together because Jesus is not what we necessarily expect him. But I would say this, that as I have looked at Jesus, as I've studied him and tried to live with what he was actually doing in the first century, I don't find this makes him irrelevant to me as a 20th century Christian. On the contrary, I find that he challenges me to think and work out new ways of being Christian, of being his follower for the 20th and the 21st century. And of course, as we've said, without the resurrection, this would all be very different. But as we'll see in the second and subsequent programs in this series, the resurrection is the thing that really then did make all the difference.